Hey, welcome back. And if you're new here, my name is Christina Kent, and I'm a fine artist based out of San Francisco. And I wanted to make this video because at the time of this filming, it is February 2025, and it has been just about 1 year since I quit my corporate job and switched to doing art full time. So in this video, I want to share about kind of how last year went, like reflect a little bit on the year, and then also answer a lot of your questions that came in about what the year's been like as my first full year as a full-time artist. So let's get to it. But before I get into that, I wanted to share with you that I'm going to be launching an online course that's all about sketchbooks. So if you're a painter and you're curious to learn how you can use sketchbooks and different sketching exercises to improve your paintings, then this course is just for you. The course will run live through the month of April. It'll be weekly classes, and you'll get to see demos of my work in real time and also get personalized feedback from me on your exercises. So if you want to learn how you can use a sketchbook practice to improve your painting, then be sure to check out the course. I'll put a link to it in the description and somewhere in the video, and you can sign up there. So last year in February of 2024, I quit my corporate job as an economics researcher and decided to jump into the world of self-employment and pursue art full-time. It has now been 1 year since I made that decision, and it's kind of crazy how quickly time flies and how much has happened over this past year. I started the year on a high because I had my very first solo exhibition in January of 2024, and that was a big success. So I sold most of the work from the exhibition. Lots of people came out. I got a lot of great publicity for it. So I felt really good about the beginning of the year. And it was kind of one of the things that helped me make the leap to decide, yes, this is what I want to do. I am going to give this a try to do this full time. Shortly after that, things took a turn. So I had all these amazing sales from my solo show, and I had some commissions too. And then I think it was around March or April where my sales suddenly tanked, and I had one of my worst months ever in terms of sales. At the same time, Instagram changed its algorithm, and it kind of started this new algorithm, and ever since then my exposure on Instagram has gone way down. So there are these two big things that were happening around March, April of last year that started to make me feel really uneasy. And honestly, it felt like my first big test as a self-employed person. Like it was the first taste of the income volatility that comes with being self-employed for many people. So that was a big stressor for me, and I made a video about that at the time as well. But I also had some really positive things going for me too. I had 2 artist residencies last year. So those were really big for me because I'd never gotten an artist residency before. And to me, it felt like a big career milestone and kind of like a stamp of approval from the art world, because I don't have an MFA, I don't have art world connections. And so for me, getting those residencies, that was a really big boost. So even though my sales were low, I had the residencies coming up, and I was feeling pretty positive about that. I also got invited to do another solo show in San Francisco, and that was nice. It was kind of last minute, so they kind of took a lot of the pieces that I had in my studio and we put those together for a show. But still, it was really nice to have that opportunity in San Francisco too. So thankfully, in the summer, my sales picked up again. I started to get more people reaching out about commissions and other opportunities like that. And I did my artist residency in Newfoundland, which was just incredible. It was an amazing experience. I got to meet other professional artists there. And that was just a really meaningful experience for me. So I think that really helped buoy my spirits, even with sales kind of going up and down. Then as the year went on, I had another show at Arc Gallery. So I showed a series of 16 paintings, Night in the City, at Arc Gallery. And amazingly, those all sold out. So that was also really exciting. And then towards the end of the year, I had my residency in Sonoma, which was lovely, and I had open studios, and I was able to sell a few pieces there. But then basically from November until early January, my sales tanked again, which it was surprising because usually holiday sales are kind of a good time for my art sales, but this past year it was not good. And I also had work at 3 new galleries in the past year that I thought the work would sell really well, and it didn't. So there were definitely times that like there were a lot of highs this past year, but then there were a lot of lows too. Oh, and I should say I got my first museum show, or I got my first piece in a museum exhibition at the Marin Museum of Contemporary Art. So that was really exciting too, because I hadn't been in a museum show before, and that was another thing that just felt like it felt really affirming that that my art was getting recognized by a museum. So yeah, lots of ups and downs this past year. It was definitely like more ups and downs than I expected, especially in terms of sales. But overall, I did well, and I did increase my revenue from last year, and I did enough to get by. I would say I'm not thriving, also especially because my expenses have gone up. I last year was my first year of paying for a studio for the whole year, and I've been working on larger paintings and things like that, have caused my expenses to increase. But overall, I did pretty solid this past year, and I'm really excited about what's coming up for 2025. So I'm about to have my biggest solo show ever at Studio Gallery in San Francisco. That's going to be March 6th through March 24th, with an opening reception on March 9th. So if you're in the Bay Area, be sure to stop by, because yeah, I've just been working on this series of paintings for the past year, and I am so excited to share them with you. It's all about San Francisco and the being in the city and finding these beautiful moments of light in the cityscape. Okay, so now I want to get to your questions. And I bunched the questions into a few general categories, so I'm kind of going to go over them by category. So the first general category is about making the switch from a corporate job to full-time art. So the question is, what was the moment or the cause that made you want to be a painter, and what is your painter mission statement? So yeah, I talk about this more in my video on quitting, but I think I've always wanted to be a painter, but I just didn't think it was possible. And then it wasn't until 2020 when I actually saw some painters on YouTube actually who seemed like they were making a living as painters, like from their art as fine artists. And then I started to think maybe this is something I could actually do. And I had gotten back into painting after not doing it for a long time. And I just felt like I just had this super strong feeling that this is what I was meant to do. Like, it really feels like a calling to me. And I think my painter mission statement, if I could sum it up, was I believe that art has this transformative power. I've noticed it in my own life. Like, since I've gotten back to painting, I just see the world in a completely new way. And it's like being present with the world on so much more of a deeper level than I was before. Like, it's almost as if I went from seeing the world in black and white to seeing it in color. And this presence is just so meaningful. And I think that art is a way to share that meaning with other people. So that's kind of what I'm going for in my art. And I hope it comes through. The next question, what benchmark did you place for income generated by your art before making the leap? So I didn't quit my job right away, but once I started selling my work and realizing like, oh, I can actually sell my art and maybe I could do this full time, I basically tried to just have my art income replace my corporate income gradually. So once I got it to about half my expenses, then I switched my corporate job to half time. And so then it's like half my money was coming from the corporate job, half was coming from art. And then I quit entirely once the income I was generating from my art sales was enough to cover my monthly expenses. That is both art expenses and living expenses and things like that. So that's kind of when I made the leap. And I also had 2 years of expenses saved up, so that even if I did hit on some slow times, I knew I would have enough money to cover that, at least for 2 years, which I felt like within 2 years I could figure something out. The next question is, what challenges did you have to adapt to when making the switch, and what advice would you give yourself now after being full-time for a year? So I would say the biggest challenge for me has been the income volatility. Like, I knew that my income would be more volatile switching from a corporate job to full-time art and self-employment, but I didn't realize just how volatile it could be. Like you can have your best month ever where you've made more money than you've made in a whole year, and then you can have your worst month ever where you make absolutely zero or very close to it, and it's really stressful having like those huge fluctuations. And like in hindsight, I can see that there are fluctuations, but like in the moment when my income goes down, I always had this fear like, oh, maybe this is it, maybe that was the last painting I would ever sell. And and so like emotionally, like rationally, you can tell yourself, oh, okay, I know this is going to happen, but emotionally it actually is, it's very hard to stay calm in those moments and not to panic. So I think I don't know if I could tell myself anything to help me prepare myself for that, but I would just remind myself that, hey, if you're self-employed, income fluctuations are normal. And in fact, the more my income has grown, the larger the fluctuations have become, which also makes sense because I'm working on bigger projects, the budgets are bigger, and if I get one versus I don't, then that can cause a huge variation in income from month to month. I got a few questions about the financial pressures on my creativity of like making, like depending financially on my art and on sales, whether or not switching to a full-time artist impacted my creativity in any way, if I'm painting what other people want or painting what I want, if I still enjoy painting as much now as I did when it was just a hobby. So I would say I definitely still enjoy painting just as much, like, and I love going to the studio every day. And now I can go to the studio like guilt-free, like I can have the whole afternoon, the whole day to just spend on my painting. And I find myself so frequently just getting lost in that state of flow. And to me, like that feeling is just amazing. I also love how like it's part of my job to like go out into the city and find inspiration or go on a hike and look for inspiration. So that I really, really feel grateful that I get to do that. And I try to remember that. I will say that when it comes to the subject matter that I paint, I only paint what I want to paint. I've always said that, I would rather get a separate job and be able to paint what I want to paint than paint things that don't feel authentic to me. Yeah, because to me, it's not, if my heart isn't in it, then it's not really worth painting. But what I will say is that I have noticed like there's a bunch of different things that I like to paint, and some things do sell better than others. Like cityscapes and landscapes sell a lot better than like portraits or figurative work that really focuses on the person. So I have shifted more towards doing cityscapes and landscapes because they are more universal themes, I think. That's not to say that I don't like painting portraits anymore, but I felt like if I really wanted to have a career painting portraits, then I needed to be like a portrait painter. And I'm not interested in doing that, at least not at this time. There's also been a benefit to doing art full time. So I feel like for my art career, it makes sense to work on larger paintings rather than smaller paintings. And when I was kind of doing it more as a hobby, I was kind of scared to work on these larger canvases. But because I realized that there were a lot of opportunities if I painted bigger, I overcame my fear and I started making these larger paintings, and they have been so rewarding. So in that sense, I'm really glad that I went that way. Another person asked, have you been able to savor the change 1 year later, or have you not processed it yet? Yeah, so it depends on the day. I tend to overcommit to things. So, I sign up for a bunch of exhibitions and I need to make a lot of work for that. I have different platforms that I'm posting to. I'm making these YouTube videos. And so I tend to be kind of just like rushing from one thing to the next, which isn't great. And then also with the financial ups and downs, sometimes I just get really stressed about that. But I do try like every day to reflect and remind myself of just how lucky I am to be able to spend so much time in the studio painting. Even if I'm working towards a tight deadline, I remind myself this is what I get to do. Like I get to be in the studio working towards this deadline, finishing these paintings. And when I can drop into that, it feels really, really good. The next question is, do you have a studio or paint at home? And what studio does an artist need to be full-time? Yeah, so I have a studio outside my home, And for me, it's been really helpful. I made a video about why I got a studio outside my home, but the main thing is it's allowed me to work on bigger paintings, and it's also allowed me to host collectors and gallerists and curators in a more professional context. So I can invite them to my studio, which I wouldn't feel as comfortable doing, like inviting people to my home. So I find it really helpful to have my own studio, but I know full-time artists who have a studio in their home or in their garage, or they figure something else out. So I don't think you have to have an outside studio to be a full-time artist. The next question is, do you feel like you wasted your PhD? And if so, how do you deal with that feeling? Also, do I have any regrets about switching to full-time? Yeah, so this is something that I thought about a lot when I was making the switch. I think I felt, yeah, there was a feeling like I was wasting my PhD, and also a feeling of guilt that I had like taken this opportunity from someone else, because I went into the PhD and someone else could have gotten that spot who would have continued down that career path. And I wrestled with those feelings for a long time. Ultimately, what I came to realize was that like the more I heard about, I mean, I read a lot of books, and reading about other people's lives, I started to notice that it seems like so many people just have these twists and turns in their lives, and oftentimes it's rare. It seems, the more I would read, the more rare it seemed to find someone who had a career path where they started on this one track and they continued on that for their whole life. So I became more accepting that, like, there are things that we're going to do in life that we think it makes sense initially, and then we realize we need to make a turn in a different direction. And I think it's just because, we can't predict things perfectly. We don't know how we're going to feel in 5 years, 10 years. And I also thought that with my PhD, I think that had I gone another path, say, had I gone to art school and maybe pursued that, and maybe stayed in the arts, maybe something else would have happened. Like, we don't really know what would have happened if I had decided not to do economics and do art school instead. But I do think that I always would have wondered what would have happened if I pursued the economics path. I mean, that brings me to the question about regrets. Like, I could regret the time I spent in the PhD, but I feel like I learned so much, not just about economics, but also about like project management. And so I feel like I learned so much, and it brought me to California, and it brought so many great things into my life. So I feel like because I'm happy with where my life is at right now, I can't say that I regret the PhD, because it helped to bring me here. The next question is there anything you miss about being in a company employed role, and do you try to keep up your economic skills as backup? So day to day, no, there's nothing I miss except the regular paycheck. That's great. But otherwise, I think I'm just very well suited to working as an artist and being self-employed. But then, like, when I sit down and think about it, like, of course, my coworkers were nice and friendly. They were very kind, great people. Like, it was nice to work with such smart and dedicated people, and work for a company that I think was doing good things. So yeah, I mean, I think there were a lot of benefits from my old job, but ultimately I'm just much better suited for what I'm doing now. And I'm not keeping up my economics skills on the side. I do like to read some economics research now and again, but I feel like, it's an interest of mine, but it's not something that I want to be actively engaged in. Okay, so the next questions focus more on the financial side of things. So the first few questions I got were about sales. How did I sell my first painting? How to sell my work, and what platforms do I use? If I sell prints or just originals, and the first steps I took to selling my art. So I do have a video that covers how to start selling your art, and I talk more about my story. But to kind of give a short recap, I started selling my work by just announcing an art sale on Instagram, and I priced my work at very, very low prices, just based on like what I was seeing on Etsy, basically. And then after that, I set up an Etsy shop and I started selling my work there. And some people also asked about my pricing strategy and how I set my prices. So I did set them based on what I was seeing on Etsy, what it seemed like I would look at artists who had kind of work in a similar style and similar quality to mine, and then I would set my work at a similar price. And then someone was asking how I knew when it was time to raise prices. So that was in combination with I started working with some galleries and they told me, okay, we think that you could support a higher price. So I started raising my prices then. And then generally, I raise my prices as my work sells out. I'll raise my prices maybe 10% when I've sold my older work and I'm starting new work. So I just kind of gradually will raise my prices over time as the work sells. Another question was, how many months worth of income did you put aside before you quit your job? Or were you making decent art sales before leaping? So yeah, so I kind of answered this earlier a bit, but I was making enough to cover my expenses before I switched to full time. And then I had 2 years of expenses in my savings. Another question is, how did I know that my work was good enough to sell? I didn't. I just, the only way I think you can find out is by putting your work out there. So like I said, I first started sharing my work on Instagram, and then I moved to Etsy, and that was like started in 2021. So it was a good 3 years of selling my work online and then at galleries as well and in other platforms before I made the leap full time. So I had like 3 years seeing my sales consistently grow. And even now that my art is selling well, there's no guarantee that it'll continue to sell well. So I think art can be notoriously tricky in that way. Like people can be really interested in your work and then you can fall out of fashion, and you have to be able to weather those ups and downs. The next questions are kind of about stability. So how stable is it to be a full-time artist? How did my earnings go this past year with regards to cost of living? And am I making the money I expected after a year of full-time? So I guess for the last question, no, I thought I would be able to double my income last year because I was kind of more than doubling the time I was able to spend on making art and promoting it, etc. And that did not happen. Partially because I made a few bets. I worked with a few different galleries that I thought my work would do really well at, and those did not pan out. And like that just happens. Like with some of these galleries, you can research the gallery, you can think that it's a really good fit, you can put your work there, but like I said, you really don't know if your work is going to sell somewhere until you test it out. So I did a few tests last year that didn't go well. I worked with other galleries that did go really well, and I continued to sell my work online, but I didn't quite meet the income goals that I was hoping to meet. I did increase my income, but not as much as I would have liked, and my expenses increased as well. So on the whole, last year I would say I was like getting by, but definitely not thriving and like not where I want to be in the long term. Another question was, if there was a step-by-step plan to get consistent sales, what would you do? What is important for a full-time artist to do? Yeah, I wish I knew a way to get consistent sales. So kind of like what I've been saying, I have noticed that my sales are just really volatile. Like some months I'll have work in a show and it'll do really well. Other months there will be no shows but I'll get a really big commission. But then other months I'll have nothing at all. So I have not found a way to get consistent sales. I have found like there are a few galleries where my work seems to sell really well. So whenever they give me space, I try to show my work there. But that's not always up to me. And so I think in the long run, I'm trying to get to a point where I have enough of these galleries where my work does well that I know that, okay, every quarter, I'm going to have an exhibition or I'm going to have a few pieces in a show at one of these spaces. And then also just building connections with collectors and with interior designers and other people who would be buying my work more regularly. Like that's kind of part of my long-term plan. But ultimately, I still don't know how to get consistent art sales. And I think that'll be one of my big goals for this year. Hopefully I can get to a point where things are a bit more consistent. The last financial question is, have you felt the need to have another job as a side gig? So I would say yes, but I kind of feel like YouTube is that job. So YouTube and teaching, I could say. So the fact that my painting sales just fluctuate so wildly, the big fluctuations are really nerve-wracking, and I'd like to get to a point where I have like my base expenses covered. I know I have those covered every single month. And so that's kind of my strategy with having this YouTube channel and also potentially teaching more, where I can have a more regular income that's like stable versus compared to the painting sales, which seem to just fluctuate so much depending on the market. Okay, and then the next batch of questions, I couldn't really fit them into a category, so they're kind of random. So the first one is, since becoming a full-time artist, what do you do for fun? Do you have hobbies to recharge? And similar question was, how do you maintain balance creating art in daily life? So yeah, like doing art full-time keeps me pretty busy. My main hobbies would be hiking, camping, going out in nature. I just get so much inspiration when I do that. And yeah, other things I like to do are still kind of like career related, like going to art openings, going to museums. I've been able to do that a lot more now that I'm doing art full time. So that's been really fun, just like connecting more with the art community here. And you could say like, well, that's still work, but to me, yes, it's work, but it's also not work, and I really enjoy it. So I would say those are the things I like to do when I'm outside of the studio. Another question is, how does location play into your career? If you were in a rural area, what would you do differently? That is a good question, and I don't think I have the best answer. I One of the reasons why I think it's worth living in San Francisco, even though the rent is extremely expensive, both for my home and my studio, but I still think it's worth it because I'm connected to an art community here, and I can go to openings. I can invite collectors to my studio. I can invite curators to my studio. And there are lots of galleries and events that happen here. It would be much more difficult if I lived in a rural area. I think for people who live in rural areas, I imagine you just have to really leverage online platforms. And then if you can, maybe travel to the closest sort of art hub, like once a year or once a quarter, to try to connect with that art scene and meet people in person, because I've found that you really can't depend on online platforms. Like in-person connections are just so crucial. So I'm sorry if that's not a satisfactory answer. Maybe if someone has experience as an artist in a rural area, you can share that in the comments. Another question is it lonely being a fine artist? And I think here it's important, like my style of creating, which is not the same as everyone's style of creating, is very solitary, but I wouldn't call it lonely. So for me, like when I'm in the studio working on a painting, I get into this flow and I just feel so connected with everything that like I don't have time. The idea of loneliness doesn't really enter my mind. And then I also have a lot of opportunity to connect with people, like here on YouTube, and also going to art openings, connecting with the art community here in San Francisco. So when I'm out of the studio, I'm usually doing those things, and that makes me feel, connected to this broader community. The next person asked, what about framing? It's so expensive. Do I frame my own work or have resources? So yeah, framing is very expensive. And if I have to, like if I'm selling works on panel, then I'll frame it with floater frames that I get from like Blick. Usually I'll use like ampersand floater frames or illusions floater frames. But for works on canvas, I tend to not frame them, partially because framing is very expensive, but also because I could pick a frame and the collector might not like it and want to choose something else. So instead, what I do is I just paint the edges of the canvas so that it looks clean, and then the collector can decide if they want to frame it, and if so, how. The next question is about social media. So some artists have successful careers without social media. How do they do this? Honestly, I'm not really sure, because I've sort of built my career starting from Instagram. But from what I've seen, I've also seen a lot of successful artists who don't have a big social media presence. So I agree, it's possible. My suspicion is that they probably have MFAs, and they probably have built a network in the art world through their MFA programs, or through some other means. And so they already have a big network that's, in real life, and they don't need social media as much. But that's just my own guess. Like I said, I kind of built my career starting from Instagram, so I can't speak to that as well. And then someone asked, how important is it to have your own website? Is Instagram enough? So I've talked a lot about my experience with Instagram over the years, and I'll link to my most recent video on that. But I don't think Instagram is enough. I don't think, especially if you want to have an art career, you can't depend on, you can't have your business depend on one specific platform, because all Instagram has to do is change the algorithm, and then that can completely destroy your business. So I think it's very important to have your own space on the internet, whether it's, well, mostly through having your own website. And then also, I do an email newsletter. So I actually have the emails of a lot of people in my audience, and I send out regular updates. And that's something Instagram and other platforms can't take away. The next question is recommendations on getting gallery representation. So I don't have gallery representation yet, but it is something that I'm interested in. I'm a little cautious about it because I think you have to make sure that, if you're getting represented by a gallery, you want it to be the right gallery. And that's one of the reasons why I've been a bit slow to get representation. But in the long term, I think that's the direction that I'm moving in. And from what I've heard from people who have representation is you want to get to know artists who work with that gallery already. From what I've heard, it seems like it's through word of mouth that people usually get gallery representation. But that's still something that I'm figuring out. Someone asked, what do you put on your CV when you're just starting out? And yeah, that can be a really important question if you're applying to opportunities, but you're just starting out. Sometimes they ask you for your CV and you don't have anything. You don't have exhibitions, or maybe you didn't go to art school, so you can't even put that for your education. For me, I put whatever I could on my CV. So if I had my paintings on view at a coffee shop, I would put that on my CV. I put literally any public place that I put my art, like that went on my CV. But another thing is to say that a lot of art opportunities don't ask for a CV. And especially if they're catered to emerging artists, they're not going to ask you for a CV because they know that you're just starting out. So sometimes I think that if it is asking you for a CV, then that could be a sign that it's for more established artists. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't apply. I think it's still good to apply, but it might just be a sign that, okay, they're looking for people with a certain credentials. So if you're just starting out, I would recommend focusing on opportunities that don't ask you for a CV and that are targeted towards emerging artists. The next question is, do you have buyers outside of the US and how do you ship to them? Yes, I do have buyers outside the US, and thank you to all of you international folks who appreciate my work and have purchased my paintings. When shipping outside the US, I usually use a standard shipping carrier like FedEx or UPS. And if it's a small painting, then I just pack a box very securely. If it's a larger painting, then I will take it off the canvas and roll it and ship it that way, because I find I don't trust I don't trust the shippers with delicate large canvas paintings. So I found rolling it is a better option for international shipments. And it also saves money because the size of the package is much smaller. So in those cases, then the collector, when they receive the painting, they'll take it to a framer and have it restretched. And the next question, have you ever had someone want to return your art and it wasn't damaged? What did you do? Yeah, so I have had this happen. So far, I think it's only happened once in the past 4 years, so hopefully it doesn't happen again. But yeah, there was a time when someone got the painting and it wasn't what they'd expected, and they asked to return it. And I accept returns within 30 days. So they'll pay the cost of the return shipping. But as long as I receive it and it's not damaged, then I'm happy to take it back, because I'd rather take the painting back and be able to sell it to someone else than have someone keep a painting that they're not happy with. And then the last question, what is your dream art career as of today? I would say, honestly, like, this is my dream art career, being able to spend most of my days painting in the studio, painting what I want, and just kind of like following my creativity where it goes is really fun. I think maybe in the future, I am interested in working on some public art projects, maybe some like large scale murals and things like that. But at least for now, I really love what I'm doing, and I just hope that I can continue like financially being able to make it work for many years to come. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. But yeah. And that's why I keep doing this despite the financial ups and downs, is that I just absolutely love painting and I love being in the studio. I love sharing my work with people here locally. I also love sharing my work here on YouTube and getting your comments and hearing about your creative experiences and just feeling connected to this broader art community. Like, to me, that's just extremely validating. So that's all of your questions. This ended up being a lot longer than I thought it was going to be, but I hope I answered your questions. If you do have more questions, feel free to put them in the comments below and I'll answer what I can. And thank you guys for all of your support over this past year. Honestly, it's been amazing to be able to pursue my painting full time, and I'm just so, so grateful to all of you. And as always, a huge thank you to my supporters on Patreon. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much for supporting this channel and making these videos happen. If you like my art, if you like my videos, and you want to help me make more, check out my Patreon at the link. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.